The Dominion had conquered 17 star systems in the last 100 years. No species had ever stopped them. Their ships burned with the heat of small suns, their weapons could melt entire cities in seconds, and their soldiers lived in temperatures that would cook any other creature alive. They came from worlds of fire and lava, where the ground itself glowed red and the air shimmered with heat. Cold was not a word in their language. They had never needed it. Admiral stood on the command bridge of his flagship, the Burning Dawn, and watched the blue planet grow larger on his screen. His gray skin was thick and cracked like cooling lava, and his 4 eyes glowed with the same orange light as the plasma cores that powered his fleet. 17 warships floated behind him, each one large enough to block out a small moon. "Tell me about this world," said to his science officer. The officer pulled up the data they had collected. "The planet is called Earth by its inhabitants. They call themselves humans. Their technology is primitive. They still use chemical rockets and basic fusion power. Their weapons are nuclear, but nothing that could scratch our shields." Made a clicking sound with his mandibles. This was how his species laughed. "And their planet, what are the conditions?" Average temperature is 15 degrees on their measurement scale. Some areas drop to -40 during their cold seasons. Cold seasons. Did not understand the concept. On his, the temperature never dropped below 300 degrees. The idea of a planet getting colder at certain times of the year was strange to him. These creatures live in such low temperatures. "They appear to thrive in them, Admiral. They have spread across their entire planet, including the coldest regions." Dismissed this information as unimportant. Cold-dwelling species were always weak. They had no fire in their blood, no heat in their souls. They would surrender quickly, and if they did not, the thermal bombardment would turn their frozen world into a proper colony, a ball of magma and ash. "Begin the invasion protocol," ordered. "Send the standard message." 600 million kilometers away, on a small mountain in South Korea, a young astronomer named was working the night shift at the observatory. She had been watching a distant star cluster when her instruments detected something unusual. 17 large objects had appeared near the moon, and they were not asteroids. Adjusted her telescope and felt her heart stop. The objects were ships. Massive ships, larger than anything humans had ever built. They glowed with an orange light that pulsed like a heartbeat, and heat radiated from them so strongly that her thermal sensors nearly overloaded. She grabbed her phone and called her supervisor, who was sleeping at home. "You need to come here now," she said. "We have visitors." Arrived within an hour, along with several military officers who had been alerted by the government. By then, the whole world knew. The ships were visible to amateur astronomers everywhere, and videos were spreading across the internet. Panic was beginning, but it was still the quiet kind, the kind where people watched their screens in silence, hoping they were wrong about what they were seeing. "They are not hiding," observed as he studied the readings. "They want us to see them." Nodded. "Their ships are producing enormous amounts of heat. Whatever powers them, it runs very hot. I have never seen energy signatures like this." The military officers spoke quietly among themselves. One of them, a young captain named, asked the question everyone was thinking: "Can we fight them?" Nobody answered. 6 hours later, the message came. It was broadcast on every frequency, translated roughly into Korean, English, Chinese, and a dozen other languages. The translation was imperfect, clearly done by machines that had intercepted human broadcasts, but the meaning was clear. "Surrender your world. Resistance will result in thermal purification." Thermal purification. The words sounded clean, almost medical, but everyone understood what they meant: fire, death, the end of everything. In Seoul, Defense Minister called an emergency meeting. The most important scientists, generals, and politicians in the country gathered in an underground bunker designed to survive nuclear war. Nobody knew if it would survive alien attack. was a small woman with sharp eyes and a calm voice. She had served in the military for 30 years before entering politics, and she had seen many crises, but nothing like this. "We have 72 hours," she told the room. "What are our options?" The generals spoke first. They talked about nuclear missiles, satellite weapons, and coordinated strikes with other nations, but their voices were uncertain. They knew, as everyone knew, that human weapons were toys compared to what floated above them. Then a man in the back of the room raised his hand. His name was, and he was not a soldier. He was a climatologist, a scientist who studied weather and ice. He had spent 30 years in Antarctica and Siberia, measuring temperatures and watching glaciers move. Most people in the room did not know why he had been invited. "May I see the thermal data on their fleet?" he asked. The room went quiet, nodded, and an aide brought up the readings on the main screen. Studied them for a long time. He looked at the heat signatures, the energy output, the way the ships positioned themselves in orbit. He noticed that they stayed in direct sunlight at all times, rotating slowly to keep every surface warm. They never passed through Earth's shadow. Finally, he smiled. It was a small smile, almost sad, but there was something else in it, something like hope. "Ministers," he said, "I do not think we need to fight them." General made an angry sound. "Then what do you suggest? Surrender?" "No," said, "I suggest we wait." "Wait for what?" Pointed at the screen, at the glowing ships that threatened to end human civilization. "Wait for winter." The room erupted in confused voices. People demanded explanations, called him crazy, asked if this was some kind of joke, but raised her hand and silence returned. "Explain," she said. Walked to the front of the room. "These ships produce enormous heat. That is their strength, but it is also their weakness. They are like furnaces with no walls. They push energy outward constantly. This works fine when everything around you is hot, but space is not hot. Space is the coldest place in the universe, and Earth's winter is coming." He looked at the faces around him, confused, frightened, desperate. "They have never felt cold," said. "They do not know what it can do, but we do. We have lived with it for 10,000 years, and now we will teach them." The council argued for hours after finished speaking. Some people thought he was a genius. Others thought he had lost his mind. General was the loudest voice against him. "You want us to do nothing," shouted. "While alien ships sit above our heads ready to burn us alive, you want us to wait for the weather to change." Remained calm. He had spent decades in the coldest places on Earth, waiting for ice cores to form and storms to pass. Patience was something he understood better than most. "I am not suggesting we do nothing," he said. "I am suggesting we understand our enemy before we waste our weapons on attacks that will not work." He walked to the screen and pulled up new images, diagrams of the alien ships based on telescope observations and heat readings. "Look at their design. Every surface is built to release heat, not hold it. They have no insulation. Their power systems run at temperatures that would melt steel. This is not a choice. This is how they live. They come from hot worlds and they have never needed to keep warm. They have only needed to stay cool." The council's chief physicist leaned forward with interest. She was a quiet woman who rarely spoke in meetings, but when she did, people listened. "You are saying their technology cannot handle low temperatures." "I am saying they have never experienced low temperatures," replied. "There is a difference. A car designed for the desert will break down in a snowstorm, not because it is weak, but because it was never built for snow. These ships are the same. They are perfect machines for hot environments, but Earth is not hot, and space, when you are not facing a star, is the coldest place that exists." Minister studied the diagrams carefully. How cold is space? In direct sunlight, objects can reach over 100 degrees. But in shadow, temperatures drop to -270 degrees. Almost absolute zero, the coldest anything can possibly be. And these ships? They avoid Earth's shadow completely. They rotate constantly to stay in sunlight. Their positioning is very precise, pointed at the orbital data. At first, I thought this was a military formation. Now I believe it is survival. They cannot enter the shadow. If they do, their systems will fail. The room was silent as people considered this. It seemed too simple, too easy. Surely an empire that had conquered 17 star systems would not have such an obvious weakness. But then humanity had obvious weaknesses too. Humans could not breathe underwater. They could not survive in vacuum. They needed food and water and air. Every species had limits. Perhaps they had simply never met their limit before. Even if you are right, said, his voice quieter now, how does this help us? They are in orbit. They control when and where they attack. We cannot force them into shadow. No, agreed. But we can make the sunlight weaker, and we can make space around them colder, and most importantly, we can wait. Earth is entering winter. For the next 4 months, the northern hemisphere will receive less solar energy. The planet will cool, and everything in orbit will cool with it. Before the debate could continue, an alarm sounded. The had grown impatient. On the main screen, live footage appeared from a Pacific island, a small nation of 30,000 people who had refused to broadcast a surrender message. The had decided to make an example of them. A single ship descended from orbit, glowing like a falling star. It did not land. It simply passed over the island at low altitude, and everything beneath it burst into flames. Trees exploded. Water boiled. Sand turned to glass. In less than 60 seconds, the entire island was burning, and the screaming had stopped because there was no one left to scream. 3,000 people died in that minute. Farmers, teachers, children, grandparents, gone. The ship rose back toward orbit, and the council watched in horror. But noticed something else. He grabbed the remote and rewound the footage, focusing not on the destruction but on the ship itself. There, he said, freezing the image. Look at the ship after the attack. The vessel was still glowing, still powerful, still terrifying. But something was different. Its color had changed slightly, from bright orange to a duller red. Its movement seemed slower, less precise. It passed through a cloud formation during the descent, explained. High-altitude ice crystals, very thin, very cold. The ship was only exposed for a few seconds, but look at the power readings. Pulled up the data. Her eyes widened. The ship returned to orbit at 60% efficiency. It lost almost half its power from a few seconds in cold air. Their systems are sensitive, said. More sensitive than we imagined. They interpreted the temperature drop as a critical failure. Their emergency protocols activated, diverting energy from weapons to heating. One small cloud did this. Imagine what a real winter could do. The council looked at each other. For the first time since the ships appeared, there was something other than fear in their eyes. There was possibility. Minister stood up. We need a plan, she said. Not just waiting, active measures. If their weakness is cold, then we need to make their environment as cold as possible. Nodded, I have some ideas about that. Over the next 48 hours, assembled a team. Was an atmospheric scientist who had studied climate change for 20 years. Was an aerospace engineer who had designed satellites for weather monitoring. Was a launch coordinator at the Space Center who knew how to put things in orbit quickly. And was a young signals analyst who had been listening to alien communications since the first day. They worked without sleep, drinking coffee and eating rice balls brought by assistants who moved quietly through the planning room. The fate of humanity rested on their calculations, and they all knew it. We cannot fight their ships, said during one late-night session, but we can change the space around their ships. We can make it hostile to them. Nodded, pulling up atmospheric models on her laptop. If we seed the upper atmosphere with reflective particles, we can reduce the solar radiation reaching their orbital position. 12 to 15% reduction is possible within a week. That might not sound like much, added, but remember, Their systems are already running at maximum heat output just to maintain normal temperatures. Any reduction in incoming energy will force them to work harder. And if they work harder, they use more power. And if they use more power, they run out. Finished. The plan took shape piece by piece. Rockets would carry aluminum particles into the stratosphere. Space agencies around the world would launch containers of ice and liquid nitrogen into orbital paths that intersected with the fleet. And Earth itself would do the rest. The planet was already tilting away from the sun, as it did every winter. They called it Operation White Death, after the Finnish sniper who had killed hundreds of Soviet soldiers in the frozen forests of 1939. One man against an army, using nothing but cold and patience. Now humanity would try the same thing. One planet against an empire, using the only weapon they had. Winter was coming, and this time winter would save them. The first rockets launched from 12 countries at the same time. It was the largest coordinated space operation in human history, and it happened in complete silence. No announcements, no press conferences. The governments of the world had agreed on one thing: they could not know what was coming. Stood in the control room at Space Center, watching screens that showed launch sites across the globe. South Korea, Japan, China, India, Russia, the United States, France, Brazil, and more. Over 100 rockets climbing into the sky, each carrying a simple payload, canisters of aluminum powder designed to explode in the upper atmosphere. First wave successful, she reported through her headset. All payloads deployed. Thousands of kilometers above, the canisters opened and released their contents. Billions of tiny particles spread across the stratosphere, forming an invisible layer between the sun and the fleet. The particles were too small to see, but they reflected sunlight back into space before it could reach the alien ships. Monitored the effects from her station in Seoul. Solar radiation at orbital altitude is down 3%, she announced. It will take a few days for the full effect. 3%. It sounded like nothing. But to species that had evolved in temperatures hot enough to melt lead, 3% was the difference between comfort and survival. On the burning dawn, Admiral noticed the change before his science officers did. He felt it in his bones, a slight cooling that made his joints stiff and his thoughts slow. He called for reports, and his officers scrambled to find explanations. Power consumption has increased by 4%, the chief engineer reported. Our heating systems are working harder to maintain internal temperature. Why? Demanded. What has changed? Nobody could answer him. They had instruments that could measure heat down to a fraction of a degree. They had sensors that could detect thermal radiation from planets light years away. But they had no equipment for measuring cold because they had never needed it. Cold, to them, was simply the absence of heat, not a force in itself, not something that needed to be tracked or studied. They did not even have a word for temperature below zero. Back on Earth, the second phase of Operation White Death began. Space agencies launched new payloads, not weapons, but containers of frozen material: water ice, dry ice, liquid nitrogen. The containers were aimed at orbital paths that would intersect with the fleet, creating clouds of frozen particles that the alien ships would pass through. Explained the science to the council during a briefing. Space is already cold, but it is also empty. There is nothing to conduct the cold into the ships: no air, no water, no material. By adding frozen particles to their environment, we give the cold something to work with. The particles will absorb heat from the ship's surfaces and carry it away. Like ice in a drink, Minister said. Exactly like that. The drink does not get cold because the ice is cold. It gets cold because the ice absorbs the heat. We are doing the same thing, just on a larger scale. The effect was not immediate. The first containers released their payloads, and the ships continued their orbit without apparent change. But listening to their communications, heard something different. They are confused, she reported. Their engineers are sending reports about unexplained power loss. Minor systems are failing, sensors, communication arrays, secondary weapons. Nothing critical yet, but they do not understand why it is happening. Nodded, this was expected. Their systems are not designed to operate at these temperatures. Components are contracting, connections are loosening, circuits are slowing down. They will try to compensate by increasing power, but that will only delay the problem. How long until we see real effects? Asked. Days, said. Maybe a week. We need to be patient. Patience was difficult when alien ships hung overhead like swords waiting to fall. Every day, people looked up at the sky and wondered if this would be their last. Cities prepared for evacuation. Families said goodbye to each other. Some people prayed. Some people rioted. Most just waited because there was nothing else they could do. On the seventh day, the temperature in orbit dropped by another 2%. The reflective particles had spread across the entire upper atmosphere, and Earth's natural tilt was carrying the northern hemisphere deeper into winter. Snow fell in Seoul earlier than usual. Ice formed on windows in Tokyo. The world was getting colder, and space was getting colder with it. Admiral held a meeting with his ship captains via holographic communication. The signals flickered and faded, a new problem that the engineers blamed on atmospheric interference. Did not care about the technical explanations. He cared about results. 3 of our ships are operating at reduced capacity, he announced. Weapons systems are unreliable. Engine efficiency is dropping. We must accelerate our conquest before conditions worsen. What is causing this, Admiral? One captain asked. Her name was, and she commanded the warship Eternal Flame. Her voice was weak, her image dim. My crew is suffering. They move slowly. They cannot think clearly. Some have stopped moving entirely. Did not want to admit what he was beginning to suspect. The conditions were not worsening because of equipment failure. They were worsening because the universe itself had turned against them. This blue planet, this frozen ball of ice and water, was somehow draining the life from his fleet. We attack tomorrow, he said. Full planetary bombardment. We will burn this world to ash and warm ourselves in its flames. But the attack never came. That night the Eternal Flame went dark. All communication stopped. All heat signatures faded. When morning came, detected no life signs from the vessel at all. 1,600 soldiers, frozen solid in the void of space. The humans did not celebrate. They watched in grim silence as the first alien ship died, and they knew that this was only the beginning. The war was not over, but for the first time humanity was winning. The death of the Eternal Flame changed everything. It was proof that something terrible was happening, something beyond their understanding. For humanity, it was proof that the plan was working. Admiral stared at the dark shape that had been one of his mightiest warships. It floated in orbit like a dead fish, no lights, no heat, no movement. When his engineers tried to explain what had happened, they could only offer guesses. System failure, power loss, unknown contamination. They did not say the word cold. They did not know how to say it. Send a boarding party, ordered. Find out what killed them. But no boarding party was sent. The shuttle that approached the Eternal Flame reported equipment malfunctions before it was halfway there. Its engine began to fail. Its heating systems could not keep up with the energy demands. The pilot turned back, barely making it to the flagship before his own vessel started to freeze. The space around that ship is wrong, the pilot reported, his voice shaking. It drains everything. Heat, power, life, it is like flying into a void. Did not understand. Space was supposed to be neutral, empty vacuum that held no threats. But this space, this cursed region around Earth, had become a weapon. On the planet below, received the news with quiet satisfaction. The frozen particles were working even better than expected. They had created a zone of extreme cold around the alien fleet, and any ship that tried to maneuver was losing energy faster than it could generate. 2 more ships have reduced power output by 50%, reported during the morning briefing. They have shut down weapons and engines to conserve heating capacity. How many are still at full strength? Asked. 7, but that number is dropping every day. Walked to the window and looked up at the gray winter sky. Somewhere above those clouds, an alien empire was dying, not from missiles or bombs, but from the simple physics of heat transfer. The universe did not care about technology or conquest. It only cared about energy, and energy always flowed from hot to cold. They were learning this lesson the hard way. By the 3rd week, the situation in orbit had become a slow-motion disaster. Ships that had once glowed like small suns now flickered weakly. Communication between vessels was failing as frozen circuits refused to transmit signals. Crews huddled around plasma cores, trying to absorb the last warmth from systems that were running on reserve power. Admiral made a decision that no commander had ever made before. He ordered a retreat. "We return to he announced to his remaining captains. "This planet is cursed. We will come back with better ships, better technology, but for now we leave." The order was met with relief from some crews and despair from others. They had come to conquer a primitive world, and instead they were fleeing from it like prey running from a predator. The shame burned hotter than their dying plasma cores. But the retreat was impossible. The jump drives required enormous power, more than any ship currently had. To travel between stars, a vessel needed to build up energy reserves for hours, storing heat in special chambers until the moment of departure. None of the ships had enough reserves. They had spent everything just staying alive. "We cannot jump," the chief engineer of the Burning Dawn reported. "We need at least 40 hours of full power generation, and our cores are operating at 30% capacity." "Then we move to a warmer position," commanded, "closer to the sun, away from this frozen death." The fleet began to move. Slowly, painfully, they adjusted their orbit to face the sun more directly. For a few hours it seemed to work. Power levels stabilized. Heat returned to the corridors. Crews began to move again, hope returning to their frozen limbs. Then Earth's shadow caught them. The planet rotated between the fleet and the sun, and for 6 terrible minutes the ships were in complete darkness. No sunlight, no external heat, only the void of space, hungry and cold. 3 more ships died in those 6 minutes. Their power systems failed instantly. Their crews had seconds to realize what was happening before their blood froze in their veins. The screams that reached the other ships were short and horrible. Watched his empire crumble around him. 17 ships had arrived. Now only 11 remained, and most of those were dying slowly. On Earth, listened to the alien communications with growing unease. She had learned to understand their language over the past weeks, not perfectly, but well enough to know what they were saying. And what she heard was not the sound of monsters. It was the sound of frightened creatures who did not understand why they were dying. "They are begging each other for help," she told during a private conversation. "Ships with more power are sharing energy with weaker ones. Crews are sacrificing their own warmth to save their friends. They are like us." Was silent for a long moment. He had known from the beginning that this plan meant killing. Not in battle, not with weapons, but through slow and terrible cold. It was necessary. 3,000 people had died on that Pacific island, and billions more would have followed if they had won. But necessary did not mean easy. "They came here to destroy us," he finally said. "They would have burned every city, boiled every ocean, killed every child. We are not wrong to defend ourselves." "I know," said, "but I will remember their voices. I will remember that they were afraid just like we were. Maybe that matters. Maybe it does not, but I will remember." The winter deepened. Snow fell across the northern hemisphere. Ice spread across rivers and lakes. And in orbit, the fleet continued to freeze, one ship at a time, as the planet they had come to conquer slowly killed them with nothing but cold and time. By the end of the fourth week, only 5 ships remained active. The Burning Dawn was among them, but even it was failing. Admiral sat alone in his command chair, watching his screens flicker and fade. His skin had turned from gray to pale white. His movements were slow, his thoughts sluggish. He had conquered 17 star systems. He had never lost a battle. And now he was dying, defeated by a planet that could not even travel between stars. The universe, he realized, was larger and stranger than any empire could understand. And Earth was the strangest thing he had ever encountered, a world where life thrived in conditions that killed his kind, where the cold itself was a weapon more deadly than any fleet. He reached for his communication panel to send one final message. His fingers moved slowly, like stone, but he managed to activate the transmission. "To whatever species monitors this signal," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "learn from us. The universe is not what we thought it was, and some worlds fight back." Then the cold took him. An admiral of the Dominion became another frozen statue in the void. The last transmission from the fleet came on the 47th day after their arrival. Was alone in the monitoring station when the signal appeared, weak, broken, barely recognizable as language. She recorded it, translated it, and sat in silence for a long time afterward. "To whatever species monitors this signal," the message said, "we were the Dominion. We conquered worlds of fire and stone. We never imagined a species could live in cold. We never imagined cold could be a weapon. We were wrong. Learn from us. The universe is stranger than any empire can understand." The Burning Dawn went dark 6 hours later. Its plasma cores finally exhausted their fuel, and the ship's internal temperature dropped below what any could survive. Admiral died in his command chair, frozen mid-reach for controls that would never respond again. Humanity had won. The 17 alien warships remained in orbit for 3 more months. They were monuments now, massive tombs circling the planet they had failed to conquer. Scientists studied them from a distance, measuring their decay, learning what they could from the frozen technology. Nobody suggested boarding them. The cold inside those ships was still deadly, and besides, there was something wrong about disturbing the dead. Eventually, orbital decay claimed them. One by one, the great vessels fell toward Earth, burning in the atmosphere like meteors. People gathered to watch the light shows, streaks of orange and red across the night sky, the last fire of an empire that had built its entire civilization on heat. Some people cheered, some wept, most just watched in silence, understanding that the universe had changed forever. Humanity was no longer alone, and somewhere out there other species were watching. In Seoul, a memorial service was held for the victims of the Pacific Island, the 3,000 people who had been the only casualties of Earth's first interstellar war. Minister gave a speech about sacrifice and resilience. General, who had once called crazy, stood in the audience with tears on his face. Did not attend the official ceremony. Instead, he went to the observatory where had first detected the alien fleet. He stood on the mountain and looked up at the stars, thinking about everything that had happened. Found him there as night fell. She had aged in the past 2 months, they all had, but her eyes still held the same curiosity that had made her a scientist. "Other species will come," she said, "now that they know we are here." "Yes," agreed, "they will." "What do we do?" Considered the question carefully. He had spent his whole life studying Earth's climate, the way temperatures rose and fell, the way ice advanced and retreated, the way life adapted to every condition the planet could create. He had never thought of that knowledge as a weapon, but the universe had taught him differently. "We prepare," he finally said. "We learned something from this. The galaxy is full of specialists, species perfectly adapted to their home environments, heat, cold, pressure, radiation. But humans are different. We evolved in every climate on this planet. We survived ice ages and heat waves. We built cities in deserts and on frozen tundras. We live at the bottom of the ocean and on top of the highest mountains." He turned to face. "We are not specialists, we are generalists. We can survive anything. And when we meet species that can handle our cold, then we use something else. Our heat, our pressure, our radiation, our gravity. Earth has everything. We just need to remember that." The news spread around the world in the following weeks. Governments that had never cooperated began sharing information. Space agencies pooled their resources. Scientists from every country worked together on new projects, studying not just the stars, but Earth itself, cataloging every extreme condition the planet could offer. Volcanic vents that reached temperatures higher than any furnace, Antarctic ice sheets colder than the dark side of the moon, ocean trenches with pressure that could crush steel, mountain peaks where the air was too thin to breathe, radiation zones where nothing should survive, yet life found a way. Each of these was a weapon, each was a defense. That had tested Earth's winter and failed. The next visitors might test something else, but whatever they brought, Earth would be ready. In the research center in Seoul, his team continued their work, developed new atmospheric tools that could change the weather over entire continents, designed satellites that could project heat or cold into specific orbital zones, trained new launch coordinators, preparing for operations that might need to happen with only hours of warning. And kept listening. She monitored the stars every night, searching for signals, watching for movement. She had learned the language well enough to speak it now, though there was no one left to speak it to. Sometimes she replayed the final transmission, listening to the fear and wonder in a dying admiral's voice. "Learn from us," he had said. "The universe is stranger than any empire can understand." Understood now. The universe was not just strange, it was hostile. Every species thought they were special, thought they had mastered their corner of existence. But the universe did not care about empires or technology or conquest. It only cared about survival. And humans, she realized, were very good at surviving. Spring came to Seoul. The snow melted. Flowers bloomed in the parks. Children played in the streets, laughing and shouting, unaware of how close they had come to extinction. Life went on as it always did, adapting and growing and refusing to die. Watched the children from his office window and smiled. They were the future now, the generation that would grow up knowing that aliens existed, that the stars held dangers as well as wonders. They would be stronger than their parents, more prepared, more aware. Behind him, an alert sounded on his computer. A new signal had been detected, faint, distant, but unmistakably artificial. Something else was coming. Did not panic. He simply sat down, pulled up the data, and began to analyze it. Whatever this new visitor was, Earth would be ready. They had tested their winters. They had failed. Others would try again. They would test Earth's heat, its pressure, its radiation, its gravity. They would bring weapons that humanity had never imagined, technologies that seemed like magic, strategies that had conquered 100 worlds. And they would learn the same lesson they had learned. Earth was not just a planet. It was a testing ground, a world so harsh, so variable, so utterly hostile that any species tough enough to evolve there could survive anything the galaxy threw at them. The stars were cold, the stars were hot, the stars were strange. But humans had been forged by all of it, and they were ready. Outside the window, a meteor streaked across the daytime sky, the last piece of the burning dawn falling to Earth. Watched it burn and disappear, then turned back to his work. The war was over, but the universe was still waiting. And humanity, for the first time in history, was watching back.